y'all, it's Laura and welcome to another Cocoa Vanilla Studio design team layout. This time we're going to be dipping into our stash for an older boy collection, but first a bit of stenciling. Now, a super easy way to do a mixed media background is simply to use ink. Now, the only gray I had in my stash, and I was just determined I wanted to use gray. The only gray that I had was an archival ink pad, and it didn't work brilliantly at first. And when it did work, it required so much pressure to get it through the stencil because it's not a very wet, juicy ink pad, right? It's intended for crisp, clear detail stamps, and so it doesn't work great for this process, and I do not recommend it for this process. But again, it was the only gray that I had, and I was just determined to use gray. So this is an Echo Park stencil, and I'm just trying to create a little bit of background detailing to put behind my design, and this is a great way to do it. Stencils with all of these tiny little bits and pieces can function as your splattering, that can function as your detail work, your scattering and splattering that I always add at the end of my layout. This sort of stenciling can fill in for that purpose. Now, it didn't for me because if you're familiar with my work, I love that detail process. Adding those little tiny details at the end is my favorite part. So of course I'm going to add more of that anyway, but I thought I'd leave in a lot of this stenciling because it really does elevate the layout overall. It gives it a little bit more depth because there's layers. When you have a base layer, then you're adding pattern paper, then you're adding photos on top. It really gives it a great deal of depth and makes that background appear just a little bit more interesting. Now, again, don't recommend this ink for this purpose. It also managed to really mess up my little dauber thing because I was having to press so hard into the stencil kind of ripped up the dauber. So again, not recommended. Now I am just going to move this stencil down one more time into the bottom corner, and then we'll have our diagonal flow from the top left down to the bottom right. The diagonal style layout is something that I really enjoy doing, and it's something that I have made a go-to design video about because I've done this so often. The idea with a diagonal flow is simply that your photos land somewhere in the middle, and then you have design work going from one corner to another, spreads across the page, and then you leave some white space on the other two opposite sides that help to balance out all the busyness that you're going to put down the middle. Now, one of the things to keep in mind with a diagonal flowed layout is that you don't necessarily need to follow other design rules. So the rule of three, a lot of us use 3 clusters of embellishments on a page. Not necessary. With a diagonal flow, you can get away with 2. You can get away with 1 on one side of the diagonal, 1 on the other side of the diagonal. Works just fine. So don't be afraid to experiment with this particular type of design. It's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy it. I think it's just something really different and not quite as heavy in the vertical and the horizontal that I normally go for. This kind of challenges things a little bit. Now, what I'm doing right now is just doing some very light stenciling around the edges of my diagonal flow to kind of smooth it out and make it so there isn't quite such a harsh line of that diagonal flow from one end to the other. This gives that background a softer feel, and this is another objective of why I do splattering on almost all of my layouts. Adding the splattering detail brings the sharper, colorful areas of the layout and kind of smooths them out into the white areas of the layout. So that way it's not such a harsh line between the background and the foreground of the layout. Now, I am bringing out my Prima metallic watercolors because I do want to add a little bit of extra splatter around the edges. Again, continuing that softened line from the top left to the bottom right and covering up some of that white space because I really wanted to concentrate my splattering right there down the middle. I don't want a ton of it coming down the other side. And then I turn my layout around because you have a little bit more control when you work in an up and down vertical than if you're working in a diagonal. So now that I've got my splattering in place, I am going to set this aside to dry. It probably took about 20 minutes with the watercolor. The ink dried really quickly, but the watercolor takes a little bit longer. So here's our finished background, and these are the 2 photos I'm going to be using for today. These 2 photos are of my oldest son, and he was pranked by his little brother, which I found absolutely hysterical. The prank was so simple and yet so incredibly effective, and I have not giggled that hard in a while. So this was for April Fool's Day, which is something that we celebrate here in the US as kind of a prank day. Not everybody participates. I don't particularly like it myself, but my boys love it. And so this little prank was that my son taped a penny, I believe it was, underneath of the faucet, so that when his brother turned on the water to do the dishes, he splashed water. The water just shot out horizontally instead of down into the sink. And so it splashed all over him. Now, my youngest son had told me that he did this and wanted me to catch it happen, because he felt like if he stood around, then Alex would know something was up and he would catch on. But he wanted me to be there and see if I could catch a picture of it. So I kind of hung out casually at the counter, and when my son came downstairs, I told him to go ahead and get started on the dishes, which is not unusual for me to say to him. That is his chore at the time. And he said, okay. And he walked over, immediately turns on the water, and got soaked. Very funny. He took it very well. He and my youngest son are both a bit of a prankster type. And so he thought it was hilarious and loved that I got pictures. So it worked out just fine. Now, this larger star that I'm starting with actually comes from the cut apart from the U-Rock collection. And I'm using almost entirely U-Rock pieces, bits and pieces here. So I'm at the end of this collection. I got 2 more layouts out of this one before it was completely finished off. And I mean completely, I had nothing left. I managed to use every single one of those little stars that are punched in there and fussy cut in there on a second star layout featuring my oldest son. So I completely smashed that collection. I was so proud of myself for doing so. There's something so satisfying in completely finishing off every single piece of a collection. And that feeling was something I was chasing a bit with this one. So I was very pleased to finish it off, and this layout was part of that process. Now, these are all fussy cut stars. These larger stars are fussy cut stars from the U-Rock collection. They had a whole page of beautiful stars, and I cut them all out because I love them. There were some smaller ones on the cut apart page, and then I used the scraps and punched little stars from the scraps throughout the collection. That's just something I normally do. If I get down to scraps that are really just too small to be used, I will quite often punch them into stars or hearts and then try to use them up that way. So following my line of stenciling, I'm adding my larger stars, then my medium stars, then some smaller stars as I go. I always start with the largest shape first, because then I know exactly how much room I have left to add the smaller stars. Now, this little Like a Boss speech bubble has been floating around with this collection for a while, like a very long time. And I have wanted so badly to get it onto a layout and just couldn't quite make it work. And so I decided to put it on this one, just because I can. And so the ending title is Totally Epic Prank, which I'm going to write in that little label area, Like a Boss. I was so impressed with my boys with this prank. A, that he took it so well, that he was such a good sport about it, and B, that his little brother came up with it. Now, I believe he found it online somewhere, probably on YouTube, but I was so impressed with the way that both of them handled themselves, and it was truly exactly what a prank should be. Silly, funny, not hurting anybody. And so that's why I was fine with it. So now that I've got my large and medium stars down, adding in the teeny tiny ones, this is my scattering on the page, and it's one of the ways that I add extra detail to my work. I really like those teeny tiny bits and pieces at the end. For me, it makes it feel finished, makes it feel a little bit fancier, I guess. All of those details really just make a big difference. I can see the change in the layout from when I start the embellishing process to those tiny details. Like, it's such a huge difference in my mind in the way that I see it. Now I am tucking in a little star there next to the word epic and added some journaling lines. So everything is now all taped down, glued down off camera, and I'm just coming in with the controlled splattering using some black Nuvo drops all around the page and my clusters, and then this one will be done. To see even more detailed photos, check out the Cocoa Vanilla blog at cocoavanilla.com.au. That's it for this one, guys. Hope you've enjoyed it. Until next time, bye y'all!